Okay, so I'm just going to do a big little spiel at the beginning just to tell you about this new kind of way of doing research that our lab's been pursuing for the last, I think the first one I launched on this was maybe like 2.5 years ago. Um, and people can write their bios and put them in the chat. I see Caleb just did. So thanks for starting the social norm there. Um, so one thing we've started doing, and it's kind of picking up speed, is doing global studies, which there's a big problem with most of the research in social psychology or all of psychology. A lot of it's from North America or Western Europe, with undergraduate student samples or now convenient samples online like Mechanical Turk. And so the studies tend to be underpowered. And so that means that a lot of findings don't replicate because they don't have sufficiently large samples, or we don't know, even if they do replicate, if they generalize to other samples of human beings or to other countries. And so one of the things we've been trying to do is run massive studies with collaborators around the world and see how generalizable and robust the types of topics we study are. The first one we published about a year ago, which was looking during COVID. We ran a study with collaborators in 67 countries, looking at the relationship between things like national identification and public health behaviors during COVID. And we published that last year in Nature Communications. And then we published several other papers from that huge data set, including one looking at conspiracy theory beliefs around the world. One looking at, we have a paper under review on intellectual humility, another one using like machine learning and looking at things like moral identification, because we had all these measures in all these countries. And I think about 40 other research teams have reanalyzed that data for other types of research questions. So it provides a very useful public good, which is a huge data set for collaborators and teams of people who couldn't otherwise get that type of data. Right now, we're in the midst of another one, in many ways, even bigger and more impressive, that Madalena and Kim are leading, looking at different interventions to support climate change initiatives, looking at what types of interventions change people's beliefs, what type change behaviors about climate change, what types of interventions change willingness to share information about messages around climate change. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kim to do this, but we're also planning others. The next big one we're going to do that we're trying to get funding for right now is going to be spearheaded by Steve and Claire, and it looks at the effects of social media on intergroup conflict and polarization around the world. There's not a huge amount of data on it, but over 4 billion people now are on social media. Average social media users online for about 3 hours a day. They scroll through about 300 feet of news feed a day. And so it's unclear what the impact of these things are on people's behavior, and especially for things like group conflict and threats to democracy. So we're in the midst of about to apply for a grant to get funding to do that. And then we have other ideas for subsequent global studies. So that's something I think that's going to be part of the DNA of our lab going forward, is every year or two kind of pursue a big, massive study that we think will be like the most definitive test of the types of issues that we're interested in. Or we'll be collaborating with other labs who are doing it. So our lab, this was led by Ali and Steve and Kim, put together an intervention to reduce partisan animosity and increase support for democracy. And ours was, I think, about the third or fourth best intervention out of 252 that were submitted. And that was led by a group at Stanford. And that paper, I think, was just submitted a couple weeks ago. And we're co-authors, and we won a huge prize, several $1,000s, because we were one of the top interventions. So we're kind of and we're looking now to get more funding to follow that up, to test that in our intervention in the field, outside of kind of a controlled lab environment. And so that's the type of thing that we've really been pursuing. It tends to be higher impact work. It's more work. Kim's going to tell you about all the pitfalls of it, but all the ways, hopefully, in which it's enriching. The other thing I think that's a big part of our lab is we just hosted a conference I did around my book, The Power of Us, with Dominic Packer at the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University last week. And several lab members, Ali and Claire and Steve, were there. And we spent a lot of time talking also with people in the real world, like business leaders, people who work at nonprofits, the director of the Renew Democracy Initiative, about ways to kind of like make our research more impactful in the real world. I know also with our climate change project, Kim and Madalena have been talking to a lot of people. We met with like the basically the equivalent of like the White House for Canada, the Privy Council office about our research and mobilizing it. And so we're trying to like get this research out and partner with more organizations who are interested in actually using it for real world impact. So we're kind of trying to do really rigorous, high impact basic science to test all our theories, get big data, see what's generalizable, but also kind of get more involved in that second part of the research, which is interventions and disseminating it to broader audiences than just your normal academic audience. So that's kind of really the vision of the lab for the next probably 5 or 10 years. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kim, who and with Madalena are spearheading the current big, in my opinion, super ambitious project on this. So, and then we're going to talk broadly at the end of this, and everybody at that point is welcome to kind of weigh in and ask questions about how can we make this a better model for research that we do in our lab or in collaboration with our other collaborators around the world. Okay, Kim, you ready to take it away?
Yep. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, it looks awesome.
All right, perfect. So indeed, I will be presenting more. Okay, so this presentation that I have today is actually recycled from the Big Team Science Conference, which was an amazing conference that took place last week online. And basically they presented all of the new big ManyLabs and big team science projects and how we could really try to improve big team science overall. So mainly what I'll be talking about today are some insights and some tips that you could use if you actually want to organize and run your own kind of ManyLabs. All right, so just to give you kind of an overview of my level of expertise anyway, in relation to ManyLabbing and big team science projects, I just wanted to really quickly present this climate project that Jay just mentioned, which again, organized and led by Madalena and myself and Jay. And basically the idea here is that we are running an international randomized controlled trial, which tests the efficacy of 11 different behavioral interventions aimed to promote climate action. And the nice thing about this is that we are including approximately, maybe a little bit less than 75 countries in our data acquisition. And we have, sorry, would it be possible for other people to mute? I keep getting a lot of feedback. Anyway, so we are collecting data in approximately 75 countries across the globe, and that is thanks to the close to 250 collaborators that we have included on this project. And thanks to this massive online collaboration, right now we are projected to have a sample size that maybe it's a little bit less now than 100,000 participants. So this is a massive international collaboration. And right now we actually started getting some data coming in, but we have not actually gone through the publication process for this yet. So most of this tips and tricks and advice that I will give is really about developing and designing, and particularly thinking about your own kind of ManyLab study. All right, so let's say that you want to lead such a massive collaboration. Again, advice and especially things what to do and what not to do. The number one piece of advice that I have for anybody that wants to run one of these large, huge projects is to really consider whether or not it's worth it to test your hypothesis via a massive collaboration. These projects are really cool. They're really picking up steam, however, and they're becoming very popular. However, it seems like a lot of the proposed questions that are being asked right now might not be the most impactful and might not be necessary to test in this kind of massive collaboration. So when you are thinking about big team science projects, you have to understand that they are incredibly difficult to do. They take a lot of time, they take a lot of effort, a lot of resources. You're coordinating between different teams of researchers. They can be quite massive. So when you're designing your hypothesis and you're designing your overall experimental design, you really have to think big, bigger than pretty much any other experiment that you've ever thought of before. And you really want to go for something that has a large amount of impact. And I'm not just talking about a publication in science, but something that ideally has a lot of impact in terms of real world application. So that would be the next one. So how can the findings from your ManyLabs actually extend to and ideally improve something in society? And also, again, coming back to this necessity, is it necessary and is it worth it to test your hypothesis inside of this type of setting? And And I'm not trying to gatekeep here, but I would really encourage people to try to not test what I kind of call small hypotheses. So these are hypotheses where you're like, okay, well, there is psychological phenomenon A and there is B, and we are going to test it in 100,000 participants across the entire planet. And that, of course, is very important to do, but maybe it's not necessary, and maybe it would be better suited to test hypothesis A versus B versus C in kind of like an intervention design, or how can you actually maximize the data that you are going to be accumulating as a result of this kind of ManyLab study. And keep in mind that at the end of this, you are going to not only look like Gollum here, because indeed, again, these are quite complicated and quite time-consuming things to do, but as well, you're going to have a massive data set in the end that you are going to be able to analyze. So try to maximize that in as many ways as you can. I think with our ManyLab study with Madalena right now, we have more or less 10 papers that we would like to publish and analyze as a result of this one experiment. So this is also something that you really have to kind of think about and layer in to your experimental design. Then my number 2 piece of advice is to really contact a lot of people that have already done or are already currently running similar big team science projects. You can also participate in the Big Team Science Conference, which is the one that I had originally presented this in. And right now they're actually going to be releasing the entire conference, all of the videos from that online. So again, if you want to do that, I highly recommend checking them out because they had some really amazing talks. Next thing, so I'm not sure why my my animations are strange. Something about Google Slides, I think. But anyway, the next thing that you should really kind of think about is whether or not it matches your kind of career stage and your overall career goals. Again, these studies can take 1 to 2 years, sometimes even more, of full-time intensive effort before they begin to bear fruit. So our study, actually, Jay released the call on social media 1 year ago when we were originally designing this project, and we only started getting data in within the last few weeks. And compared to some of the other ManyLab studies that I've seen so far, it seems like this is actually relatively quick. However, I would also suggest that participating in such a study is really great, especially for early career researchers, especially very early career researchers, PhD students, etc. The reason why is because you really get exposure to how different teams run different types of science. You get exposure to analyzing different types of data sets that normally you wouldn't encounter. For example, if you are coming from neuroscience and you're taking part in a ManyLab study, having this kind of crossover between something big on the psychological side with something more fundamental on the neuroscience side would be really great. So now let's say that you have decided that indeed you have your hypothesis and you want to test things in a ManyLab setting. The number 1 question that I get when I'm talking about our project is, how did you get so many collaborators on board? Like I mentioned before, we have somewhere around 200, 250 collaborators. And the answer is that it actually literally all started with a tweet from Jay. And again, this was on November 3rd. He went and said, we plan to launch this global study next year comparing interventions. Sign up here if you are interested and reach out to us. And somewhat to my dismay, the vast majority of collaborators were recruited based on this tweet. And I think he also published on all of his other social media platforms. And why do I say that's somewhat to my dismay is because I spent several months reaching out to collaborators, mailing lists, my network, etc. And I did not have even 1/8 of the 1/100th of the impact that Jay did from releasing this single tweet. But let's say that you don't have access to a professor that has something close to, I think now, Jay, do you know, are you at like 45,000, 50,000, 80,000? I'm not sure.
40, 42, or 43, something like that.
Yeah, so Jay has a pretty hefty social media presence. If you don't have access to Jay, first of all, I would highly suggest that you reach out to him and collaborate with him. This is my other number 3 piece of advice. However, of course, there's a lot of professors, a lot of amazing professors out there that also have such a hefty social media presence. It might be also very strategic for you to reach out to some of them and bring them on board. You can also, again, reach out to a lot of people who are doing the big team science projects. They also already have the network set up, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, you could also take advantage of the tried, tested, and true networking techniques. This is tapping into your personal and professional networks, reaching out to various mailing lists, You can try cold emailing. I think I managed to get probably 5 collaborators out of our 250 from just literally writing people an email, being like, hey, I don't know you, but this might be within something you might be interested in. You can also present a call at conferences and presentations. And you can ask everybody and their mother to spread the word, and especially fellow big team sciencers, because indeed, from what I understood, especially from this big conference, is that the vast majority of people recruit fellow collaborators via social media. And this is just an example of a presentation or a call that I gave when I was presenting, I think at SPSP, where I was like, if anybody is really interested, please reach out to us. We are organizing this really cool experiment. All right, some other things to think about in terms of collaboration. You have to remember that the norms of dealing with collaborators in this kind of setting are vastly, vastly different from the norms when you are interacting only with 1, 2, or a small number of collaborators. And what you really want to do is be as specific as possible, especially when it comes to the roles that each collaborator has to take on and how they can actually get authorship on your paper. So this is ripped directly from our website, which is quite funny because there are versions of this on many of the ManyLabs that are coming out after this. Indeed, we said, okay, authorship will be very much limited to 2 researchers per team. Also, people can collaborate either by collecting data, or they can propose the intervention, one of the interventions that is tested in our ManyLabs, or they can also provide us with monetary contribution that is similar to more or less collecting at least 500 participants worth of data from a specific country where we don't already have data collection. So here we have something like 35 or 40 people that are interested in helping us to collect data in particular in Africa, for example. So yeah, that is a very, oops. Okay, again, not sure why my animations are all messed up, but another suggestion from me to you is to try to reduce the barrier to entry for your collaborators as much as possible. You have to remember that a lot of these collaborators are coming to this. Maybe they don't have the amount of resources, for example, that NYU does. So how can you keep things as easy for them to opt into as possible? One way is to obviously keep the survey as short as possible. I suggest aiming for 5 to 10 minutes. That way you will actually hit something more like 15 minutes. Our survey is quite a bit longer, and I know that this has been problematic for some people collecting data, again, especially in countries where they're not currently inhabiting. You can also align incentives for people at multiple levels. So for example, authorship number seems to be something highly motivating for a lot of our collaborators. You can also offer them kind of early access to the full data set. So I think right now what we are planning to do is once the main one of the main papers is reached review stage, review and resubmit, then we will actually allow all of our authors to have access to the full data set so that they can also run their own additional analyses and test their own hypotheses ahead of kind of more non-collaborator academics. You can also encourage collaborators to add their own variables. Ideally, they're going to do this only at the end of your survey, and that way they can also test more kind of what I call them local hypotheses and or conduct their own mini labs inside of your study. So right now, the oceanic region, they are conducting their own mini labs in relation to climate change, particularly in Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, et cetera. And I know that they have all kind of worked together in order to create a kind of coalition where they will be testing some local hypotheses. You can also give a chance for collaborator feedback. This one has a question mark on it because it worked out really well for our ManyLabs study, but I saw at the Big Team Science conference that that's not always the case. Basically, what we did is we released a Google document online and let everybody that was collaborating comment on it, ask questions, ask for clarifications, and in particular, give ideally useful feedback. I think it worked out really well in our case, but indeed, I would say it was one really good comment versus 10 or 15 comments that were not so good or not so useful. So you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons of doing that. Another thing which kind of really sucks in this context is that you have to be prepared for predatory people. And what I mean by that are we had several people that reached out to us and they were like, hey, we would like to participate in your ManyLab study, but we don't have any money. Can you please give us, I think one person was like, yeah, $20,000, $2,000 of that is to print the survey, which the survey is an online survey, so there's no reason why they would need to print it, things like this. It really sucks, and it doesn't feel nice when you feel like people are trying to take advantage of you in that context, and especially if you are an early career researcher, I could see that being even more uncomfortable, let's say. And then kind of along the same lines is really you have to balance a little bit interpersonal dynamics, which can be indeed challenging to manage. Our ManyLabs, thankfully, has not had a huge number of problems so far, basically just only one thing that isn't working out. But I know some of the other ManyLabs teams have had a lot of problems with people overstepping, trying to take over the ManyLabs. Yeah, it can be quite complicated. Some even more things to think about are the design. So remember, you have to scale your design according to the needs of your project. So for example, if you're going for an international level, how are your stimuli, especially your outcome variables, and your stimuli elements and your design going to scale? How are they going to translate? Are you going to be asking the same thing and tapping into the same processes if you have like a very specific scale that's been translated between 15 or 30 different countries? How are you going to take care of that? In addition, when we asked people to submit their interventions originally, a lot of people said, okay, well, it would be really great if we could use, for example, a video of David Attenborough talking about the BBC specials about how amazing planet Earth is. And of course, that would be amazing, but how are you going to translate that across our 20 plus different languages? Here, things become quite complicated. Again, translations for the overall survey. We did not give, I think, if I could go back in time, I think we would have given a little bit more insight and instruction on how our researchers should have taken care of the translations themselves. We didn't do that, and we kind of left it up to them. So I think, yeah, maybe we will run into the problems in that in the future, but this is, again, something to think about. And of course, being very clear and about your statistics and your statistical models, right? You want to you're probably going to be running mixed level models. How are you going to pull your variance? How are you planning on including your fixed effects, your random effects, when, where, what, and why? And of course, also open science, putting everything on, for example, GitHub, which is what we are planning to do, also on OSF, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, the last one to kind of think about is funding. Do you need funding? Is it necessary to have funding? This really depends, of course, on your design, right? For our design, we didn't need funding up until a point where then we decided that we did need funding, and that was a little bit complicated. So in the end, we managed to get quite a sizable chunk of funding for our particular project. But I know that there are some other ManyLab studies that don't really need as much funding. Yes, GitHub, Open Science, etc. And then a little bit more general advice, tips and tricks. If, as soon as you can, set up a project-based website with a contact form and in particular an FAQ page. I think overall, this was one of the best things that we did here, because indeed, every time somebody would send us an email, it would be like, please see your FAQ page, please see your FAQ page. You will get hundreds of emails in this context, and it's a lot easier to please see FAQ page than going and attempting to respond to each one of them. In addition, set up a project-based email address. Whatever you do, do not put your own personal email on your website or on your ManyLabs study, because you will wake up in the morning and you will have hundreds of emails. It's really quite impressive. I know with the Trust in Science ManyLabs, I was talking with the person who designed that study, and I told her this, and she was like, yeah, no, I don't think it'll be that big of a problem. And then I noticed last week that indeed they now have tispsmanylab@gmail.com on their website. And Victoria was like, yeah, I probably should have listened to you. In addition, also, you can set up an automated response with a contact form and link back to the FAQ page. So here, again, a lot of the collaborators are going to email you and they're going to ask the exact same questions. You can just set up this auto response to put them back to the FAQ page, explain a little bit, okay, so please keep in mind that this is a huge project and we get so many emails. Please see the FAQ page, and if your question is not answered there, then please reach out to us again. In addition, one thing that we did not do soon enough, which caused a little bit of complication in the beginning of our project, was set up a project-based mailing list. So in the end, we ended up going with MailChimp. I know that there are some other mailing list servers that you can go with. Again, I would highly recommend that you set this up basically as soon as you set up your website and your email address and everything else. also a manual. We did this for the climate study where basically we very specifically went through how to adapt the survey, how to submit the data, how to submit the ethics. Here's where you can find this information. Here's where you can do this. If you have questions about this, please contact this person. And as time has progressed, we keep going back and updating this manual, adding more information so that our collaborators know exactly what to do, when to do it, and where to do it. An important thing to remember is that you need to work smarter. You very much need to protect your time. So I highly suggest that you automate anything that you can. So for example, setting up these auto responses. Jay was the one who suggested we do that in the end. And indeed, thank God, because we wasted quite a bit of time, especially me going through and trying to respond to every person's email. Also, I would highly suggest that you get an excellent army of research assistants to help you run your study and another reason to use the project-based email address is because then your research assistants, you can give them the password to that and they can go in and start to answer some of the questions that are very repetitive and relatively easy to respond to. And this one sounds a little bit harsh, but we would also suggest that you do not meet with people. If you meet with 250 collaborators, 15 minutes each, that's 50 hours worth of meetings directly. So you really have to be quite specific and quite choosy. I know in the beginning, I was more like, yeah, let's meet these people, let's meet these people. And Jay was like, no, let's save our own time, let's save some skin, et cetera, et cetera. Here, okay, so I'm gonna skip over this because this is a little bit old, but that is pretty much the end of the presentation. It's just thanks to the people who had organized and invited me to the Big Team Science Conference. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or Jay, Amanda, if there's anything that you want to add, maybe we can open the discussion.
Yeah, let's see if Madalena has thoughts or comments first, and she's deeply
I thought Kim did a really great job just kind of covering everything. I'd be happy to take questions if anyone has something specific that they'd like to add or ask that hasn't been touched on.
Yeah, so maybe just raise your hand either personally if you're in the room or virtually, and Madalena and Kim and I can take your questions, and hopefully it'll lead to a generalized discussion about this type of approach. Other things like, what are we missing? What questions, like I know several people in the lab want to do one of these. What other things do you want to know about that we can discuss here? Or what are our blind spots? Okay, Jesper, fire away. You're on mute. The room's on mute. So whoever has the room thing.
So you touched a bit on this, but I just wanted you to maybe elaborate a bit on how you actually decided on kind of the specific design, how kind of open was the process. I assume that there'll be kind of tensions in terms of interest, both at the core team, but also in terms of potential collaborators. Could you just elaborate a bit on that process?
Yeah, sure. Basically, the way that we did it is we first released a call and we were like, okay, we want to stimulate climate action. Here are some kind of rough ideas of the dependent variables we are very interested in targeting. If you think that you have an intervention that would be important, especially to test on an international level, please submit it to us. And we ended up getting, Madalena, do you remember, like 50 or 60 intervention proposals?
Initially, there were 35.
35?
Interventions, yeah.
And then we kind of narrowed it down internally. We came up with an overall design. And then we released that design when it was in a relatively advanced stage already, so that collaborators could go and be like, okay, so here are some things, maybe you should add this, maybe you should change this. So we really kind of played with this balance between letting them also have their input, which was again very valuable, but also kind of still remaining some control and having this kind of like executive decision-making power so that we could be like, okay, yeah, maybe this one, yeah, they make a good point, but we can probably ignore that for the moment. Or yeah, this person is completely right. Let's add this item. Let's talk about this. Let's do this and this and this.
And a question, sorry, let me just add to that. A question I get a lot is, you know, there's so many degrees of freedom in building an intervention. I mean, maybe the big theory behind, you know, like system justification or decreasing psychological distance, like maybe this sounds like, oh, maybe that will be the winning intervention, but there's so many degrees of freedom in actually implementing the intervention that, you know, a priori, just based off of the name of the theory, sounds like it should be the best thing that works. And so the way we kind of made sure that the best possible intervention is being implemented in terms of like what stimuli are being displayed, how the wording is exactly kind of designed, and in what order, and how long it takes, and how many stimuli you present, and all of those decisions. So in order to maximize the effectiveness of that, what we did is, like what Kim said, we went back and forth with the intervention proposers, perhaps like 5 times. They submitted something initially, we gave them feedback, they sent it back, we gave them feedback, they sent it back, we were like, okay, maybe there's ways to improve it. Another thing we did is we then sent it to everybody, to the 300 people, and everybody commented on everything, on all of the 11 interventions that were in finalized form. Then we included those comments. And then the last thing we did, which I think is critical, is we then contacted the experts of the theories that we used in each intervention. So we sent the system justification intervention to John Jost, and he commented. He commented on the implementation of his theory into the intervention per se, and so on. And so we did that for every single one of the 11 interventions. We went to the experts that were mentioned in the paper that inspired the intervention, and then they had a final say in how the intervention was implemented. And so with that, we kind of made sure that the final version of, what people or participants will actually experience in the experiment is actually like its best possible form, because there's a lot of bad ways to implement a really good idea. And so that process needs to be really thorough. In order to spend, like Kim said, all these resources on testing some interventions that are not well made, like you can imagine. And the other big issue here was adapting each intervention to each country, because something that will work in an American context will make no sense in Zambia or in Australia, or who knows, around the world. And so that's the other thing that we did, is developed this manual on how to adapt each intervention to each country. And this is on top of just translating it, but actually make the changes. Like some of the images had to be changed. For example, for decreasing psychological distance, the way you would do that is to kind of refer to examples of climate disasters in people's region. Because if you tell someone in Kenya that the US is getting flooded, maybe that won't decrease psychological distance. You have to talk about things that happened in their neighborhoods, in their vicinity. So there was a huge amount of effort in us thinking about each intervention, how will it apply in each context.
Madalena, can you show the ratings that we had for each intervention, where we had all our collaborators rate them on their scientific merit and their broader impacts or real world relevance?
Yeah,
I actually have it here.
Oh,
do you want me to?
Yeah, and just kind of explain it. That'd be great. So just show kind of how we had people rank or rate these and what that looks like.
And that's at priority, like before you set them
yeah,
up.
we did this. We collected this data from our collaborators at the point where we only had the title and abstract of each intervention. So this is what people thought would work by only hearing the process that we're going to target. So dynamic social norms will make use of the psychological process known as dynamic social norms, which has been found to increase, to influence behavior over and above static social norms by doing this and this. That's it. And that's what people used in this initial iteration to make these predictions.
So we also had the effect sizes that were reported from the literature, which I think the effect sizes would very much correlate with the practical support here.
But what we're doing now is we're collecting these same predictions after people actually go through the actual surveys themselves for each intervention. for a more informed, perhaps, decision on what you think will work best after you've seen how it feels to go through this intervention.
So did you have any pushback, somebody opting out after you went back and forth with them on the interventions?
Yeah, I think the interventions of, I think for psychological distance, the person submitted something really bad. It was back and forth a lot. They kind of didn't go through. And then
I think we actually just immediately were like, nah, let's just go to the experts on that one, because indeed the one that was proposed was really just a copy paste of the WHO website information about climate change. And we were like, that's, yeah.
So what we did is just, we went to the expert. So the person behind who actually wrote the initial paper on that process, on that mechanism. And we asked that research team, would you like to actually design this for us? And then they said yes, and designed it right away. And he had one of his grad students kind of get on this, and now we're
work with us.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think the question was, did we have anybody drop out after in terms of collaborators that were collecting data?
Oh yeah, that happened. A bunch of people, for sure.
Yeah, when I said 250 collaborators, and now maybe it's less, indeed, we had throughout the entire process, people were very on board, and then there was a little bit less enthusiasm, and then people were like, oh, but I don't actually have any money to do this, and then da-da-da-da-da. So 250, 200 is really just like at some point I was like, I'm going to stop tallying how many people have signed up, because, and use this kind of approximation, because yeah, we had people signing up, dropping out, signing up, dropping out, then signing up. And then, yeah, some people were like, oh, I did find money.
Yeah, but there's still people trying to sign up now, a year later. So there's always kind of like an ebb and flow of collaborators.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I have a question. Are we muted on the room? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so first of all, this is amazing. All the organizational stuff is like super helpful, especially since we're like planning our global study right now. So thank you for all this wisdom. I guess my question is, how do you ensure like quality control? Because you're giving like these researchers just like a lot of trust, I guess. So like when you ask people to like translate to like the surveys and stuff, how do you like ensure that the translations are good, or do you primarily trust the research teams to do good translations? Also, another question is like, how do you ensure, I guess, that the samples that they collect are good? I don't know like the extent to which you like require or request like representative samples, or like whether you're more okay with convenience samples. So yeah, that's my main question.
Yeah, so I mean, they're both excellent questions. And indeed, at some point you have to trust your collaborators quite a lot in this type of project. In terms of quality checks, we are asking all of our collaborators to obviously send us the QSF file, because everything was programmed into Qualtrics. And if you don't know, QSF is the Qualtrics file type. So basically, there we will be able to look at their data, and we will, if needed, which I'm not sure how much effort we're going to put into this, but if needed, we will be able to go back and say, if we look at the data and we see that there's some countries that have some really like large outliers, we can go back and we can look at their original data files to see more or less how they did the translations, how they did everything in that regard. And for the translations themselves, like I mentioned before, I think that we didn't give enough description on how to do the translations. Since then, the TISP, the support for Trust in Science, ManyLabs, I would suggest that you check out their manual and how they formatted everything there, because they did, in my opinion, a better job than we did. They had very specific, okay, use back translations. You have multiple people either on your team, or you have multiple people that, for example, all of the Germans and all of the Germanic speakers, they collaborated in order to translate. So then split the team into one half, one person translated it forward, the other person translated back. You can sit down and like dispute where you think that there are some discrepancies, et cetera, et cetera. So when it comes to translations, I would highly recommend that you follow their model. What was the other question?
Yeah, so it was like ensuring like quality of the samples they collect. Also, I don't know like how much you're like requesting like representative samples.
Representative.
Especially like there are lots of like hard to reach countries that you're collecting data from, in like Africa, for instance. So I don't know like the probably much harder to get representative samples from there. So like, yeah.
Actually, so we paired with a market research team called the Market Science Institute, and they have access to a huge network of other research networks that are going to help us that are helping us now with the data collection. And actually collecting data in Africa is actually a little bit better because there we will hire them to do it and we know that we will have representative samples. When it comes to the samples provided by our collaborators, we wanted to reduce the barrier to entry, and representative samples are incredibly expensive. So we stressed on our website, we really, and on the manual, please, please, please try to go for representative samples when possible and where possible. However, we will also include and accept convenience samples and student samples. So in the end, when we do our statistical analyses, we will try to control for people who did give us representative samples and those that did not, and see kind of a little bit, see how that goes when we're doing the analysis. Nada, do you want to take the other data quality question?
Yeah, for the data quality question, so that we have a couple of questions, attention checks embedded in the study, just to make sure that participants, are paying attention, exclude people who are not paying attention. And so we already instructed our collaborators to exclude or to flag people who didn't pass both attention checks in the final file that they send us. And I should also say there's a huge kind of instruction manual on how we want the data to be sent to us, so that it's easier on our end to aggregate and to append all the data sets in the same big file that we will then use to analyze. And the other thing we did, which is as we're getting the samples in, right? We have I think 4 samples already. We are looking into ways to ensure that the data that is being submitted is not just random noise. So one thing you can do, as you may know, is go into Qualtrics and say, click the button that says simulate, 1,000 random answers to each question, download and send that. So that's something that someone might do. And so now we have, I wrote a chunk of code that tests whether, I picked a couple of variables and it tests whether there's any signal as opposed to just noise in those measures. And I compare that to samples where I know that I trust kind of, so for example, the sample from the US that Rob Willer sent, right? That's someone that I kind of know and trust. So his sample I'll treat as this probably was collected right. And I'll look at the ratio of signal to noise in some variables, and then I compare it to the same variables in these new samples where I don't know that much about the person who submitted the data. And then there's a couple of quality checks just to make sure that all they did was not just click the random noise button. The other thing I would say is that I tried to actually run the initial multi-level models on just random noise to see whether they would work. I was trying to pilot the code. And I should say, if there's no signal, it actually, the models don't converge because they're ill-specified. They expect a little bit of signal and not just noise. So that's another way you can tell a sample is phishing.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank
and I mean,
you.
you can also do the traditional thing where you look for correlations where you would expect them, and if you don't find them there, at the individual country level or at the individual team level, then you start to do some kind of investigation to see, oh, okay, so we know that, for example, political orientation should correlate relatively strongly, even internationally, with climate change belief. Okay, so which samples does that go in the direction that you think that it will? Which ones don't have, et cetera, et cetera. And you can use this as kind of to sniff out whether or not the data that you have is actually true and real, let's say.
Yeah.
But thanks for all the prospective students for coming and all my current lab members. Thanks especially to Kim for giving that talk, and for Madalena for helping moderate and lead the discussion around the project you two are leading. Really useful to just hear all these thoughts and questions about it. Okay, thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks everyone for coming.
Bye.
Bye.